Welcome to First Baptist Church of West Monroe. I'm Toby Frost, Executive Pastor, and I'll be serving as the moderator for tonight's event. Here at First West, we seek the truth, and so for 4 consecutive Wednesday evenings, we will be dealing with various important issues that have perplexed and fascinated people both inside and outside of the Christian faith. This evening, our Truth series features a debate on the subject of, did Jesus rise from the dead? This will be a civil debate between 2 distinguished scholars who will investigate answers to this question, both pro and con. We will also hear later on this evening from our senior pastor, John Avant. Our first debater is Mike Licona, who joins us to argue for the proposition that Jesus rose from the dead. Mike has a PhD in New Testament studies from the University of Pretoria, South Africa, which he completed with distinction. He also serves as external research collaborator at Northwest University in Potchefstroom, also in South Africa. Mike was interviewed by Lee Strobel for his book, The Resurrection of the Real Jesus, and has appeared in Strobel's video, The Case for Christ. He's the author of numerous books, including The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, Paul Meets Muhammad, and was co-author with Gary Habermas of the award-winning book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. He is co-editor with William Dembski of Evidence for God, 50 Arguments for Faith from the Bible, History, Philosophy, and Science. And Mike is a member of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Institute for Biblical Research, and the Society of Biblical Literature. He has spoken on more than 50 university campuses and has appeared on dozens of radio and television programs. His website is www.risenjesus.com. It's a valuable resource for those wanting to learn more about the resurrection of Christ and other subjects in the area of Christian apologetics. We're also pleased to welcome this evening Shane Puckett to argue against the proposition, did Jesus rise from the dead? Shane is an instructor at Louisiana Tech University in Ruston, Louisiana, where he also serves as director of debate. He has taught classes in debate and discussion, argumentation, principles of speech, public speaking, professional speaking, rhetorical criticisms, American rhetorical traditions, and applied forensics. Shane has served as coordinator director of the Louisiana Tech Debate Camp from 2007 through 2011 and has coached 3 national debate champions. He also has served as a peer reviewer for the Journal of the International Public Debate Association from 2008 to 2011. Prior to coming to Louisiana Tech, Shane served as instructor, assistant director of forensics at Truman State University in Kirksville, Missouri. He also worked as events and programs coordinator for the English-speaking Union in London, England. He has traveled both organizing and coaching speech and debate teams. Finally, as a debate competitor, at Arkansas State University, Shane was a national quarterfinalist in 1999, ranked 32nd debater in the world in the year 2000. Shane, a debater with credentials like this, can really argue either side of a debate, so we expect that Shane will do well tonight. If Shane does really well tonight, I have updated copies of my resume to distribute to everyone at the end of tonight's event. Let's welcome our guests, Shane Puckett and Mike Licona. Mike and Shane, I want to reiterate to you, are not enemies. They are opponents tonight, but they're not enemies. Both are working to help us to explore all sides of a perplexing and fascinating subject. Many people, both inside and outside of the Christian faith, have always thought that the resurrection is simply an issue of blind faith. But it is our confident hope that regardless of where you stand on this subject, that both Christians and non-Christians alike will be surprised at the amount of thought and scholarship given to this subject. We are certainly instructed in Scripture to love the Lord our God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength. We are certainly attempting to do this tonight. Our debate will begin with Mike making a 20-minute presentation, followed by a 20-minute presentation by Shane. Then a couple of periods will be held in which the debaters will be able to challenge and question one another. And then finally, our audience will have the opportunity to ask questions to the debaters by lining up with the 2 microphones on either side of our auditorium. Any question on the subject is allowed, but it must be short and written down to show our microphone host that it's in the form of the question. No long questions, short questions only, and no speechifying or point making is allowed. We just want questions. Dr. Woods Watson is our timekeeper because we checked and Les Miles couldn't do it. So Woods will be able to help us. When the time period is up, Mike and Shane, when the time period is up, Woods and I will quietly indicate by saying time. And the participants will have 10 seconds or so to close their comments. If that doesn't happen, you will hear a bell. If you hear the bell, the audience will break out the tomatoes and pitchforks that we have distributed to them in advance of the debate. Audience, feel free to laugh, be engaged in the debate, cry, laugh, slap your knee, slap the person next to you. However, lengthy applause, whooping, and touchdown dances are discouraged. We are a friendly church, so both members and guests should know that booing of our debaters, and especially booing of the moderator, is not allowed. Let's welcome our debaters again. Mike, it's your turn. Get us started.
Thank you and good evening. It is great to be here. I'd like to thank John Evan and Toby Frost for inviting me to participate in tonight's debate. I used to work with John and Toby, and they are some of the very finest men I've ever worked with. I've worked with a lot better women, but the finest men that I've ever worked with. They were just a blast. I'd also like to say that I'm honored this evening to be on and share the platform with my opponent, Shane Puckett. And when Toby sent me Shane's resume and said, hey, by the way, here's your opponent. And I'm looking, I'm saying, ranked number 32nd in the world. I said, what have you got me into? And this guy was ranked 32nd in the world 3 years before my first debate. Thanks a lot, Toby. So, I guess, though, if I get my butt kicked tonight, I'll know how you felt after Monday's football game. Well, this evening's question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? I'm a Christian. I believe that Jesus did rise from the dead. But in a debate, it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what I can prove. So let me start off by setting a realistic expectation, and that is what I mean by prove. In the discipline of history or any of the scientific disciplines, when we talk about proof, we're talking about reasonable and adequate certainty. There is no such thing in the sciences or in the discipline of history as 100% mathematical absolute certainty. It's just not going to happen. I mean, how could I prove that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 44 BC? I can prove that, but not with, 49 BC, but not with absolute 100% mathematical certainty. We look for reasonable and adequate certainty. That's how we do it in any of history. It's how we do it in scientific explanations as well. And so when I say proof tonight, I'm saying I think, as a historian, we can prove that Jesus rose from the dead with reasonable and adequate certainty. So tonight, I'm going to construct a positive historical case for Jesus' resurrection using 2 major building blocks, facts and method. Let's start with the facts, and here I'm going to give 5. Now, maybe you think I'm going to go to the Gospels because the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, have the resurrection narratives in them. We all think of the resurrection narratives when we think of the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I believe that the Gospels are historically credible, reliable accounts of the sayings and deeds of Jesus. But there's a lot of things that we New Testament scholars discuss, like who wrote the Gospels, when they were written, do the Gospels contain contradictions? Do they contain any elements of myth or embellishments in it, and things like this? And there are a lot of things we can prove. There are some things we just accept by faith. And so rather than get off on a discussion on the reliability of the Gospels, I'm going to be building my case this evening on literature written prior to the Gospels by a once skeptic named Paul. Now, Paul hated Jesus. He hated the Christians, thought Christianity was a dangerous cult of the Jewish religion. And he was arrested. He was a Jewish leader. He arrested, he imprisoned, beat, persecuted, consented to the execution of Christians. And then all of a sudden he became one because he had an experience that he was persuaded was an appearance of the risen Jesus to him. And that experience radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. Now, I'll give you an idea of where this would have taken place historically. Most scholars today believe that Jesus was crucified in either April of 30 or April of 33. We really don't know which one. I mean, you got evidence that seemed to point to either. We don't know which one, but it really doesn't matter. So for the sake of tonight's discussion, let's just pick the round number of 30. So we'll say Jesus was crucified in the year 30. Scholars then believe that Paul had his conversion experience that he believed was the risen Jesus 1 to 3 years later. Let's just call it 2 years later, and so now we're at 32. Paul, later on, will write a letter to the church at Galatia. And in chapter 1, Paul says that 3 years after his conversion, 35, he goes up to Jerusalem and he meets with Peter, the lead apostle there, and he also saw James, the brother of Jesus. And he said he spent 15 days with Peter. Now, what's interesting is that the Greek word here that Paul uses for meet with or visit with Peter is hysteresai. What English word do you think we get from that? History. You see, Paul had not been a disciple of Jesus during Jesus' ministry. He may have heard him. He certainly knew enough of Jesus' teachings in order to think the Christian church was a cult. But he wanted to get the whole 9 yards from those who knew him. And so he spends 15 days with Peter. In Galatians chapter 2, Paul says that 14 years later, he goes back up to Jerusalem. We don't know if that's 14 years after this visit or after his conversion. But so it's 11 to 14 years later, or it puts us in the year either 46 or 49 AD. And Paul says that the reason for going up to Jerusalem on this occasion was to meet with the pillars of the church, and he names them, Peter, James, and John. Now remember, he'd already met with Peter and James the first time. This is the second time, and now throw John, another one of Jesus' closest disciples there. And he meets with them, he says, for this reason. He wanted to run the gospel past them. That is the message he'd been preaching, to make sure he hadn't been working in vain all these years. And then he discusses this with, imagine being in a room, you got the Fab Four, Peter, Paul, James, and John. Wouldn't that have been cool? And asking them theological questions. Tell me what Jesus said. Tell me what he said after this happened and after he turned over the tables in the temple and all this. It would have been pretty neat. So after a discussion, he says, they added nothing to what I had to say. They extended the right hand of fellowship to me. In other words, they said, you're good, Paul. Keep up the good work, brother. So we have Paul here who says he's preaching the same thing that the Jerusalem apostles who walked with Jesus, knew Jesus, endorsed his teachings, what he was teaching, to be what they were teaching. Now, if all we had on this was Paul's word, we could say, maybe it's truthful, but maybe Paul's just saying this in order to give his teachings and himself credibility. Historians look for corroborative data, and here we have plenty of that when it comes to Paul. Did you know that some of the apostles had disciples of their own? Peter had a disciple named Clement of Rome, and John had one named Polycarp. Do we have anyone pregnant in here tonight? Any pregnant people? Yeah, okay, great. Well, listen, if you're thinking of any boys' names, keep those in mind. Clement, Polycarp. Hey, Clement, it's dinner time. Polycarp, I told you, leave your sister alone. Just think of those names. So here, if Paul was teaching heresy, was teaching essentially different than what the Jerusalem apostles were teaching, we would expect Clement and Polycarp to correct and chide Paul on the matter. We don't find that in their letters, though. In Clement and Polycarp's letters, we find them, when they speak of Paul, you have Clement say that he places Paul on par with his mentor Peter. And he says that Paul, and I quote, accurately and reliably taught the message of truth. Polycarp refers to the blessed Paul in his letter, quotes from Paul's letters twice and refers to them as part of the sacred scriptures. This is not the kind of things you say about someone who's teaching heresy. It is precisely the kind of thing you say about Paul if he was teaching what Peter and John, the Jerusalem apostles who walked with Jesus, were teaching. So we have corroborative data. I could give you more, but that should suffice for now to show that when we are reading Paul, on the gospel message, the essentials of the Christian faith, we are hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the kind of stuff historians drool over. Now, a few years after this meeting that Paul had, Paul goes up to an ancient Mediterranean city named Corinth and starts a church there, the First Baptist Church of Corinth. And a couple of years after that, Paul is engaged in exchanging letters with the church at Corinth. They're sending him letters. Hey, Paul, we want to know, how do we live the Christian faith? What about this? Can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? Do Gentile Christians, do they need to be circumcised? You know, all this kind of stuff that they're thinking about. And then they'll ask other questions, doctrinal questions, and Paul would exchange and answer their questions. Several of these letters took place. One of these letters is what we now call 1 Corinthians. That was written around the year 55. And just to give you an example, the Gospels aren't going to be written, according to what most scholars believe, 10 to 40 years later. So we're talking about some really early stuff here. Now, Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, it's a chapter all about resurrection. He's answering their questions about the afterlife. Is there an afterlife? What's it like? Are we going to have bodies in it? Paul starts off in verse 1. He says, I want to remind you of the gospel that I preached to you. The gospel I preached, the same gospel he had endorsed by the Jerusalem apostles in being in alignment with what they were preaching. Now we're about to hear what we can certify as the official and formal proclamation of Jesus' disciples. And here's what he starts off, and he says this. And you know what? I'm a little bit behind on my PowerPoint. Let me bring this up. There we go. 5 facts. Fact number 1, Paul was an eyewitness. Fact number 2, Paul knew Jesus' disciples. Fact number 3, Paul taught what they taught. Here we are at fact 4. They were teaching. Here's what they were teaching. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I delivered to you what I had received. He's talking about oral tradition here that he received from the Jerusalem apostles. I delivered to you when I established the church in Jerusalem, or in Corinth in 51. What I also received before then from the Jerusalem apostles. Again, we're looking at eyewitness testimony from the Jerusalem apostles here. What were they teaching? Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, to the 12, to more than 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive, some have died, then to James, and to all the apostles. And then Paul adds, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me. We have 3 individual appearances, to Peter, James, and Paul. Remember, Paul had met with Peter and James on 2 occasions, so he's getting this directly from them. And then Paul, he had his own experience. And then there's 3 group appearances, to the 12, to more than 500, to all the apostles. This is important because it strongly suggests these were not, whatever the experiences were, they weren't hallucinations. Because modern psychology tells us that hallucinations aren't group appearances. At least group hallucinations would be extremely rare, if not impossible. So, the 4th fact is that they were teaching that Jesus had been raised from the dead and had appeared to them in individual and in group settings, to friend and foe alike. Fact number 5, they were teaching that Jesus was raised physically. Now, this isn't a resurrection narrative, a biography of Jesus that Paul's writing to them, and he doesn't mention the empty tomb, so where do we get bodily resurrection? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. You see, throughout Paul's writings, several times he says that the way Jesus was raised from the dead is the way we as Christians will be raised from the dead. And for example, Romans 8:11, he says, the Spirit who raised Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies. Jesus' mortal body was raised, our mortal bodies will also be raised. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 20, Paul says, Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. To be asleep was a euphemism in antiquity. It's like today we say he passed away rather than saying he croaked. In antiquity, you'd say he fell asleep and went to be with his forefathers rather than saying he died. The first fruits is an agricultural term. It refers to the first of the crops to be harvested. How many of you have had a garden in your yard? Most of us have. You know that tomato plant you have in there? tomatoes are getting ready toward the end of summer. You're just waiting, and that first one gets ready, and it's ready. The day comes, and you say, yeah, it's perfect. And you pick it off the plant, and you slice it up, and you put it on the chicken sandwich, and I'm hungry. And you eat it's like, great. And then all of a sudden, you're waiting for those rests. They're not ready yet, but they're coming. That's the first fruits. Jesus is the first to be raised from the dead. Now, wait a minute, Mike. I know you're not using the Gospels, but we're in church here, and the Gospels say that Jesus raised Lazarus. He raised the widow's son, Jairus' daughter. How can Jesus be the first? Because they were raised in the same kind of body, just to die again. In the context of 1 Corinthians 15, Paul's saying Jesus was raised in an immortal resurrection body that he will go on to explain. Okay, Jesus the first fruits. When are the rest? When are the dead going to be raised? When are the apostles going to be raised from the dead? When are our loved ones who have already died before us, when are they going to be raised? Paul answers that question 3 verses later. He says, but each in his own order. Christ the first fruits. After that, those who belong to him at his coming. So the rest of the believers are going to be raised when Jesus returns. What happens to them in the meantime? Well, Paul addresses that elsewhere. In 2 Corinthians 5:8, he says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. In Philippians 1:23 and 24, he says that Paul says, I could die and be with Christ or remain in the body. So the idea we have is when a believer dies, their body is buried, their spirit leaves the body, goes to be with Christ in heaven, and exists with Christ there as a disembodied spirit. When Jesus returns, he brings the spirits back with him, puts them back in their corpses, raises the corpse, and transforms them into an immortal, glorious, powerful body that's animated or empowered by the Holy Spirit. It's a physical bodily resurrection. And if Christ is the first fruits of those who are asleep, of the dead, and we're going to be raised in a physical body, that means Jesus was. Those are our 5 facts. The question is now, what do we do with those facts? And that leads us to my second major building block, method. Now, you say, how do we do this? Well, history, again, there's just like scientific method, historical method has a subjective element to it, but we use criteria in order to find the best explanation, and we find it generally works pretty well. The criteria are common sense. Let's imagine we're in a med school right now, and in med school, there's a professor and they're teaching all the students how to make a proper diagnosis. So they say, okay, we got a 15-year-old male, he's robust, he comes in, he says he's got a fever, he's been vomiting, he's got abdominal pains in the lower right side. What's going on? One student says, well, it sounds like the flu. The professor says, well, that explains the fever, but it doesn't explain the other 2 symptoms. That's rare with the flu. And you want to account for them all. So that is what we would call explanatory scope. You want to account for all the facts, all the symptoms. The other one, another student raises her hand and she says, well, maybe this is just a rare instance where you have the flu and you have these 2 rare symptoms that come with it. Professor says, well, that's possible, but it's very, very improbable. It's unlikely. So we can't rule it out, but we want to look for the best explanation for a diagnosis. So that lacks explanatory power. Another student says, well, how about this? The guy's a martial artist, and so he goes to practice that night, wanting to fight through his fever, and he's sparring with someone, and he gets kicked in the abdomen. And then he goes out to eat afterwards and gets food poisoning. That accounts for all of the symptoms, but all of them, and you don't have to force it to fit. The professor says it does, and you're very creative. You get an A on your creativity. However, the problem is you're speculating. It's ad hoc. There are non-evidenced assumptions there. And the more ad hoc your diagnosis is, the more chance it has of being false. The professor says, look, it's an appendicitis. This fits perfectly to say appendicitis. It accounts for all 3 facts, does so without forcing them to fit. There's no improvisation or speculation involved here. And it's plausible because it's in agreement with other widely known medical knowledge. When historians are going to do the same thing with the facts that they get. The resurrection hypothesis, for example, accounts for all 5 facts that I just gave you a moment ago. Facts that are extremely strongly attested, historically speaking. It accounts for all of them without forcing any of them to fit. It accounts for all of them without any non-evidenced assumptions. At the most, Shane may be able to argue and say, well, yeah, but you're assuming God exists. Well, even if I were to assume that God exists, it's not a non-evidenced assumption. There's good evidence that God exists from philosophy and science, such as the cosmic constants for the fine-tuning of the universe and the irreducible complexity of the cell. These all point to an intelligent designer of the universe, strongly suggests it. So it's not, the only thing I guess you could say then, well, is it plausible? Now, I know that it's very implausible that people would be raised from the dead by natural causes. But no one ever claimed that Jesus was raised by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus. And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then it's very plausible that he'd be raised. All 100 billion people who die and stay dead, that proves that dead critters stay dead apart from God's intervention. But if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, it's a 100% probability that Jesus would be raised. The problem is, as historians, we don't know ahead of time whether God would want to raise Jesus. So we can't say one way or another, whether it's plausible or implausible. We just have to say it's inscrutable, it's indeterminate. So the resurrection hypothesis, at the end of the day, fulfills 3 of the 4 criteria for the best explanation that you see here with flying colors and doesn't fail the 4th. And when you compare this with other naturalistic hypotheses, such as legends, lies, hallucinations, myth, all these things, Jesus never died, the resurrection hypothesis is not only the best explanation, it is by far the best historical explanation of the data, and thus it should be regarded as an event that occurred in history. And let me tell you, this excites me as a Christian, because it tells me that what I have believed by faith has been confirmed by historical investigation, that God exists and that he has actually revealed himself to mankind in Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Before I begin, I would like to go ahead and thank Mike for that speech. I would like to thank Dr. Avant and Dr. Frost for inviting me here tonight. I would also like to thank the congregation of First West for this discussion. I think it's very interesting. Now, before I begin actually looking at methodology, oral traditions, I want to say the things that Mike brought up, I promise I'll get to directly and show direct refutation shortly. But I need to establish a little bit of ground for, I guess, this side. So I would like to begin by saying to the people that believe in Jesus' resurrection, you have faith. And your belief in the resurrection is done through faith. And that's fine. That's great. Your faith and your strength in your faith makes you a strong Christian. I am an agnostic. It's quite different from an atheist, and a lot of people get these confused. An atheist says there is no God. An agnostic says, I don't know. There isn't conclusive evidence to prove either way. So I understand, as an agnostic, the reasons why you believe, the reasons why you want to solidify the belief and why you believe what you believe. Therefore, tonight's debate is not about the existence of Jesus. Tonight's debate is not about the theological resurrection of Jesus. And this debate tonight is definitely not about your faith. This debate tonight is about Mike's approach, Mike's methodology to try to prove his faith historically. Tonight, I'm going to show you the problems that exist with oral traditions. I'm then going to show you that it's not just problematic by using Mike's methodology, but it's outright dangerous for your Christian faith. Unlike Mike, I'm not a historian. I'm a communications theorist. I specialize in rhetorical devices, basically the spoken and the written word. To help you understand the complexities of the spoken word, I'd like for you to take a quick listening test. I was watching a legal studies professor explain these same complexities to his students in terms of, or in the realm of the law. He was reading this story that I'm about to read to you. It's not very long, and it's not loaded with a bunch of facts, and you won't have to remember it for a very long time either. And I'm giving you heads up, warning that you're going to be quizzed on it in just a second. Okay? This comes from the Virginia Pilot. Last night, agents of the Norfolk Police Department found 3 victims of an apparent murder, dead in an apartment in the East Ocean View area. The apparent victims of a gangland-style slaying and possibly the victims of gang-related violence. The police are investigating this as a possible murder and suicide, and they now suspect that the 3 were all killed by the same individual. No suspects yet have been identified in the slaying, but veteran police detective George Brook has said that the police are following up on evidence pointing to the possible involvement of an off-duty naval officer as the perpetrator. The bodies, which were found by the apartment manager around 8 o'clock in the morning, appear to have been slain sometime earlier in the same evening, possibly between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. That's it. That's all I'll have you to remember, and I promise it's not going to be for a very long time either. I'll quiz you in just a few minutes. But before that, let's look at some of the evidence that Mike gives you. Now, while most of his arguments stem from outside the Gospels, it still is dependent on the Gospels. So before we can actually look at his argumentations, which again, I promise I'll get to direct refutation soon, let's look specifically at the Gospels. Let's look, because he brought up dates, let's look to when these Gospels were written. Mike and I will agree that these books were written decades after Jesus' death. We'll start first with Mark. Most apologist scholars would explain that the earliest of these books not only was Mark, but it was written around 7 AD. Matthew, Luke coming a decade or more later, around 80 to 85 AD, respectively. And finally, the last book being John, written around 90 to 95 AD. However, many historians would claim that these books are second generation or second century text. That doesn't really make too much of a big deal. Regardless, Mike and I will still agree that these books were written decades after, if not generations after Jesus' death. Even though we use the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we really don't know who wrote them. These books weren't written in Aramaic, so probably not by the disciples. Most of the men that traveled around with Jesus at that time were illiterate. Most historians would attribute these books to be written by elite, second-generation Greek Christians, primarily because they were written in Greek. Most historians also would agree that these stories had to pass through an oral tradition to be written many years later. Now, I keep throwing that term around, oral tradition. Oral tradition. What do I mean by oral tradition? An oral tradition is nothing more than the standardized account of events being passed down by generations through the act of storytelling. Oral traditions are not oral histories. Dr. Atassi, a professor and historian of ancient world's histories, explains that an oral tradition doesn't begin until a story is standardized. What he means by that is that it will pass through 100, if not thousands of mouths before it gets standardized. The story, the oral tradition of Jesus' crucifixion and Jesus' resurrection didn't originate at the crucifixion. It went through multiple mouths standardizing the story. And most of the time, these standardized stories don't get completely standardized until something is written. So as it passes from storyteller to storyteller, the possibility increases of details and interpretation of details to be distorted and changed. Not only were these stories accidentally changed just by word of mouth, but Mike will agree, and it's a well-known fact, that storytellers at this time were given certain liberties to change stories to meet cultural differences as well as interest at the time. Well, because information changes and gets distorted in storytelling, we don't allow this information in our courts. This information, second-hand information, is considered hearsay information in our legal system. It's also the reason why federal rules of evidence, specifically Rule 801-2DA, if you want to look it up, is the reason why police officers will tell you everything that you say will and can be used against you, not for you in the court of law. Professor Gilbert, who specializes in storytelling, explains that in any single linear exchange, that's just when information goes from one person to the other, that information is always lost, and up to 50% of information can be lost in any single exchange. Okay, let's look at a few questions from that article that I read you a few moments ago. Hasn't been that long. You haven't been under any kind of duress or stress. Let's start with an easy one. How many people died, or how many people did the police find shot to death last night at the Ocean View apartment? A1, B2, 3, yeah. Okay, let's just go ahead by a show of hands. Let's see what you believe. Was it A, 1? Who in here thinks it's B, 2? C, 3? D, 4? Well, you're all wrong. Can anyone tell me why? Right. I didn't say bullet. I didn't say shooting. I didn't say gun. I said gangland-style slaying, which can imply something, but it doesn't mean that anybody was shot. But I understand why you thought that, because that's how our minds work. We fill in details. We make assumptions. This is called the uncertainty principle in communication. The uncertainty principle explains that whenever you receive information, you process it through your previous experiences and your previous backgrounds. When information flows from one person to another in storytelling by way of the uncertainty principle explaining things, information looks like Swiss cheese, okay? There's a lot of holes. And either you fill in those holes with your own assumptions and make the story make sense to you, or you disregard that information as unimportant or as unappointed. So this is a quick example on how oral traditions can be so problematic. But besides the inherent flaws of using oral traditions as a primary and only source of information, it's an unreliable tool in a methodology to prove that events happened. Let's turn our attention to these standardized versions of oral traditions that I keep talking about: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Let's look specifically at these texts as historical sources. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying these texts aren't good theological sources, but they are problematic when you start using them as historical sources. The reason why is depending on which gospel you read, you get a different story. Not just different in the details either, different in the big picture as well. Now, if you examine these gospels individually and then compare these stories, you'll start to notice discrepancies. You'll start to notice contradictions, not only with chronology, but also with the omission of details and actual differences of events. Let me just go over a few, and don't think that I'm pulling a fast one on you because I'm a debater. Look these things up. I give you source citations. Please check my information. Read these books and compare them for yourself. Let's start with an easy first one. Who carried Jesus' cross? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus gets help from Simon of Cyrene. However, in John, Jesus carries his own cross the whole way. All right, no big deal. What about number 2? Although the Romans never crucified thieves, how many thieves were crucified with Jesus according to the gospel? And what did these thieves do? In Mark, the thieves were mentioned, but they really didn't have a conversation. In Matthew, both thieves taunted Jesus, but in Luke, only one thief taunts Jesus while being criticized by the other. Then Jesus promises the second thief that they would be in paradise that day. Be in paradise that day. That contradicts the book of John and contradicts Acts, which says that Jesus wasn't ascended until 40 days after the resurrection. When did Jesus die? Mark states that Jesus died the morning of the Passover meal when it was eaten. However, John says that Jesus died the afternoon before the Passover meal was eaten. The day of preparation. Direct contradiction. Was there an earthquake when Jesus died? Matthew explains that at the moment of Jesus' death, a massive earthquake strikes, which opens up the tomb, and dead people rise from their graves. Mark, Luke, and John mentions no earthquake. There is no earthquake or dead people rising from the graves ever mentioned in any historical account, which is strange, given how monumental that event would have been. Where was the first appearance of Jesus? Mark says Jesus appeared to Mary Magdalene, but it's not clear where. In Matthew, Jesus appears near his tomb. In John, Jesus appears at his tomb. Then in Luke, Jesus appears in Emmaus. That's several miles away from Jerusalem. Finally, the Gospels agree that the empty tomb was found by women, but it's in dispute how many women and what they did after. Matthew says there were 2 women, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and says the women ran away with great joy. In Mark, there were 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Salome, and these women were amazed and afraid, so they kept quiet. That contradicts Luke. Luke says there were 5 women, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary mother of James, and others, but Luke tells us that these women ran off and told the disciples what they saw. Finally, in John, there's only 1 woman, Mary Magdalene, and she told the disciples that the body had just been stolen. I concentrate only on the discrepancies that are found around the crucifixion and the resurrection, and I only pull out a quick 6. I promise you, you go and compare these stories, you will find out that there's hundreds. Not only are there discrepancies and contradictions throughout the 4 Gospels when you compare them, but there's also huge story differences. This is when the overall message is different. Let's look just specifically at the crucifixion through the eyes of Mark and then through the eyes of John. In Mark, Jesus is completely silent. Simon Cyrene carries his cross and Jesus says nothing. The 2 robbers mock him on the cross. Jesus says nothing. It's only until Jesus' dying words does he say, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" In this story, Jesus is introspective. Jesus is looking inward to himself concerning with what he's dealing with, what he's going through. That's a quite different message when we look to Luke. In Luke, Jesus is not silent on the way to be crucified. He comments to some weeping women on the road and says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and weep for your children, for the fate that will befall you." We can see here that Jesus is more concerned with the fate of the women than he is of his own. When Jesus is being nailed to the cross, again, he's not silent. Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." This is another example of how Jesus is looking outwardly and more concerned with others than himself. Next, while Jesus is hanging on the cross, the first robber starts to mock. Then the second robber comes to Jesus' defense. The second robber asks Jesus if he will remember him when Jesus cometh into thy kingdom. Jesus says unto the second robber, "Verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise." Again, another example where Jesus is looking outwardly, not inwardly. Finally, we can see the differences in these last words, where in Luke, Jesus' last words are, "Father, into thy hand I commend thy spirit." Besides the obvious contradiction in last words, again, the theme is different by these words. He's not forsaken like he is in Mark, but in Luke, he's accepting. Compare any Gospels with the others. These examples just show how the Gospels are not accurate. And if these books aren't accurate to themselves, how can we trust that they're accurate at all? If an author feels like they can change details of the story, how do we know that they don't feel free to change the substance of the story? Finally, I want to discuss why this methodology is so dangerous for your Christian faith. This is Horus. Horus is an Egyptian sun god who lived in 3000 BC. Broadly speaking, the story of Horus is as follows. Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Mary. At his birth, he was accompanied by a star in the east, and upon his birth, he was adorned by 3 magi, wise men. At the age of 12, he was a prodigal child teacher, and at the age of 30, he was baptized by a figure known as Anup, and thus beginning his ministry. Horus had 12 disciples that he traveled about with. He performed miracles, such as healing the sick, walking on water. Horus was known by many gestural names, such as the Truth, the Light, God's Anointed Son, the Good Shepherd, the Lamb of God, and many others. After being betrayed by Typhon, Horus was crucified, buried for 3 days, and thus resurrected. Whether original in Horus or not, these attributes permeate many cultures for many gods throughout the world. They seem to have the same mythological structure. This is Addis, born of the Virgin Nana on December 25th. He was crucified, placed in a tomb, and after 3 days, he was resurrected. This is Krishna, born of the Virgin Devaki, with a star in the east signaling his coming. He performed miracles with his disciples, and upon his death, he was resurrected. This is Dionysius of Greece, who was born of a virgin on December 25th. He was a traveling teacher who performed miracles, such as turning water into wine. He was referred to as the King of Kings, God's only begotten Son, the Alpha and Omega, and many others. Upon his death, he was resurrected. Finally, this is Mithra of Persia, who was born of a virgin on December 25th. He had 12 disciples and performed many miracles. Upon his death, he was buried for 3 days and thus resurrected. He was referred to as the truth, the light, and many others. And interestingly enough, the sacred day of worship for Mithra was Sunday. In fact, the fact of the matter is that there have been numerous Christ figures from around the world at different periods which subscribe to these general characteristics. Beyond the historical deities that predate Jesus that I just talked about, there were many people claiming to be Christ while Jesus was still alive. The term Christ just means anointed one. This is just a short list of the people we know to be claiming to be Christ around the same area and the same time that Jesus lived. Then there was this man, who was claimed by his followers to heal the sick, raise the dead, walk on water, walk through walls and buildings. He was persecuted for his religious beliefs, brought to trial by the local Roman courts, crucified, rose from the dead, and came back to life where his followers saw him. This is not the Jesus story that you will all know so well. This is the story of Apollonius of Tyana, who lived at the same time and close to the same area as Jesus. I give you these examples to say this. The Bible as a theological text is fine, but when you start using it as a historical text, it becomes problematic. If you have faith in the Bible, that the Bible is the inspired Word of God, and it's the faith that binds you to your beliefs, that's great. But don't look to a flawed methodology to replace your faith. If you use a flawed methodology to prove theology as history, then historically you prove the existence of all these other gods. Not only is this approach problematic, but this approach is outright dangerous to your Christian faith. Thank you.
Mike?
Hello? Oh, Shane. Okay, great. All right, let's talk about this. You're a debate coach. You teach debate. Can you explain to us very briefly what is a red herring?
Sure. A red herring gets its name from it's more from the British Empire. And basically what it is, its operational definition is nothing more than a false jurisdictional argument. And it's when you would throw something out that's true, and it even might be pertaining to the subject. Like if for some reason you were the defense attorney in a court of law and you're defending a guy that was caught with marijuana, and your arguments was, well, he had a prescription for it and he needs this in order to live. Let's just say all those arguments were true. The question within the court of law is what's legal and what's illegal. So while everything that what he's talking about is true, is real, it falls outside of the jurisdiction of the question being asked. Does that make sense?
But a red herring doesn't, when you give the arguments, they don't have to be true.
Oh, you're right.
There are things to sideline you, to get you off topic, right?
It can be.
Okay, now you said, you give all these objections against the Gospels. You said many historians say they're second century texts. That is false. That is not true. Very few say that. You say we don't know who wrote them. They're not written in Aramaic. They got contradictions, things like this. Now, I did not base my case on the Gospels. I based all of it on Paul's letters, which predate the Gospels by 10 to 40 years. So would you explain why your all criticisms of the Gospels
Okay.
are relevant and not a red herring?
Okay, first let's look to everything that you said from Paul. And remember, you said directly that Paul got his information from other people. He went to disciples of disciples or just the disciples. Whether or not, we're still looking at an oral tradition here, right?
Right.
So when we look to Paul specifically, I promise I'm going to answer your question. When we look to Paul specifically, he doesn't get any of his information directly from Jesus
Except his own appearance.
or observation.
Except when he had an experience that he thought
Okay,
was the risen Jesus.
and you even say that he had his experience, let's just throw it out there, 2 years, okay? At the point that he never physically met Jesus, and at the point that he didn't see the embodied, resurrected Jesus, he only had a vision.
Why do you say it's a vision? That seems like
Because-
a big thing there.
I don't know what else you would call it.
Whatever the experience was that Paul had, it was enough to convince him that Jesus had been raised bodily from the dead.
Sure, and there's
But
many
that's not
people
answering
that-
the question
okay.
about the Gospels here. Why is what I'm
Well,
saying about
I
Paul?
try to explain that not most, all the information that we have about the resurrection, and while I focus primarily on the Gospels, is because that's usually what we see as our primary source of understanding Jesus' resurrection.
Right, and I said that, but I
we
used Paul.
see that we see that as an oral tradition, and all of the arguments that I explained to you are the problems that we see through oral traditions, that standardized account by storytelling, and we can't really trust that.
Okay, so you're saying the same problems that you list that beset the Gospels also beset what we're talking about with Paul. Is that what you're saying?
Sure.
Okay, so that's why it's not a red herring. Okay,
Right.
Let's talk then about oral tradition, because I don't think that that is the problem here, because
Okay.
you said oral tradition, oral histories pass through thousands of mouths before standardized. What we have with Paul, as I explained, and what we have here with 1 Corinthians 15 and things listed there, is directly from the mouths of the Jerusalem apostles. So you have Paul attesting to his own appearance, but when you're talking about the death, burial, resurrection, appearances to Peter, Peter and James, that's directly from them. That's not thousands of mouths. He's getting it right from them. So we're talking
Right.
about direct testimony from the eyewitnesses or the alleged eyewitnesses. So we could accuse them of lying or of having hallucinated or something, but the passing through thousands of mouths that get corrupted and everything before Paul even gets it doesn't work here.
Well, how many tens of, maybe even hundreds of hands did you show or see that would attest to me saying that 3 people were shot last night?
Oh,
in an
okay,
Ocean
but the difference
View
here is that
apartment?
was a quick one. Oral tradition is something that's repeated over and over and over. They had
Right.
regulations for this. They had controls for this. That's nothing like what you did right there.
Yeah, but I explained that even in storytelling, Professor Gilbert, who specializes in storytelling to get us to an oral tradition, explains that information is always lost when told or in any linear exchange. And it's in...
Time.
Okay. Sure. Let me kind of gather a few things. Let me look through your facts real quickly. You say the first fact is that Paul was an eyewitness.
Right.
An eyewitness to what?
Well, I said that Paul had an experience that he sincerely believed was of the risen Jesus who appeared to him.
Okay, so any sincere experience is the act of Jesus or the act of God that I'm experiencing.
No. What I'm saying is Paul had an experience that he believed was of the risen Jesus who appeared to him.
Okay.
And the disciples had the similar appearances or experiences in individual and in group settings. And it wasn't just to friends or disciples, it was to a foe like Paul. So, they were convinced that Jesus had been raised physically, bodily. So, as a historian, I've got to account for all of those things together. And what I'm saying is the resurrection hypothesis is the best historical explanation for all of those facts combined.
So what eyewitnesses account, I'm going off, not Paul here, what eyewitnesses account attest in any written document that you've explained, eyewitness account to seeing Jesus' body resurrected?
The sources that I'm quoting, all right, the sources that I'm appealing to in the case the affirmative case that I presented for the resurrection, I'm appealing to Paul and the Jerusalem apostles as is reported in 1 Corinthians, Galatians, 2 Corinthians, Philippians.
So you have no recording of an eyewitness. Just basic. When you say eyewitness here, you're not really meaning eyewitness.
You mean
of
to
the
see
body's
Jesus
resurrection.
actually raised and coming out of the tomb?
No, just see the bodies, the body of Jesus
Well, that would have
animated
been
after
That would have been
crucifixion.
Peter, John, the 12, the more than 500, all the apostles, and then last of all, Paul.
Okay, and you read this from their accounts.
No, well, I'm reading this from Paul, who gets it directly from them.
Okay, the oral tradition. You
Yeah.
say Paul knew Jesus' disciples. Again, doesn't that prove the oral tradition, the storytelling that I'm talking about?
Yeah, he's getting it directly from them.
Okay. What was your third? I'm sorry, that went by kind of quick, and I didn't write it down as quick. What was your third fact?
The third fact was Paul was teaching what they were teaching.
Okay. You know what? I want to quickly jump to your methods, just because I'm running out of time here. Explanatory scope. So, in order to have explanatory scope, has to account for all the facts.
Right.
Okay, I'll give you that
Or
one.
the one that accounts for the most of the facts is to be preferred.
Sure. And I'll give you an alternative scenario that I want you to compete with your methods in just a second. Explanatory power accounts for the facts without forcing or any ambiguity. Wouldn't you, supposing that Jesus was God, and supposing that there is a God, be ambiguity?
Why would that be ambiguity?
Why would that be fact?
Well, I wasn't supposing, that wasn't part of my case that Jesus is God.
Okay. Well, explanatory power has to say that there is a fact that God exists, okay? Because to account for facts, God raising Jesus, wouldn't that be ambiguity?
I don't see where it would be ambiguous. Ambiguous would mean there's a fuzziness. It's like I'm really not explaining. And when I say Jesus was raised, they believe that it was God that raised Jesus from the dead.
Okay.
So as a historian, I can't prove that God was the cause, although I think he's a pretty good candidate for it.
That's if he was risen.
Huh?
That's if he was risen.
If Jesus was raised,
Okay,
right.
yeah. All right, you say that you need something to have less ad hocs, okay? The idea of an ad hoc has to be based out of the ideas of possibility. In order to be an ad hoc, it has to be possible. By definitions, miracles are not possible. That's what makes them miracles. So at the point that you say there is a God, and at the point that you say that Jesus rose from the dead, those aren't ad hocs, correct?
Well, no, ad hoc would be a non-evidenced assumption.
Right, but they have to be assumptions based on possibility.
Right, and if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, it's a real possibility.
Okay. But we have to understand the ideas behind okay, he gives you the concepts of possibility and plausibility, and we need to understand what that means. Plausibility means most likely, possibility means in a billionth of a chance. Our sun blowing up in the next 5 minutes, possible, but it's not that plausible. So at the point that one of your criterions can't even be met by, sorry.
Yeah, well, it's okay, so I'll go into my 5 minutes. Okay, so in terms of possibility here, if God existed and wanted to raise Jesus, I think it's very probable, it's 100% probable that Jesus is going to be raised. As a historian, I'm not presupposing God's existence or that he'd want to raise Jesus. What I would suggest is, as a historian, because I can't prove that God would want to raise Jesus, as a historian, I'm not privy to that kind of knowledge. But I'd say that what we have to do is look at the evidence and let the facts speak for themselves without presupposing God's existence or a priori excluding it. Otherwise, we place ourselves as historians in a dangerous position where we allow our historical investigation to be guided by our worldview. And of course, the dangers manifest in that. Bad philosophy corrupts good history. Now, you had mentioned about all these parallels like Dionysus and Attis Krishna, Mithras. Are you aware that in just about every one of those cases that you mentioned, the reports of them rising from the dead, if they existed at all, are post-Christian by several hundred years?
Sure. But at the point that we have as much data, as much fact, at the point that you say we can apply this methodology to this case, then you have to apply that methodology to the other cases. your methodology creates polytheism.
Actually not, because I'm very happy to apply my methodology to these others, like Apollonius of Tyana you mentioned. He died at the end of the first century. He was a historical figure, a real person. He died at the end of the first century, but the first account that we have is the biography of Philostratus.
You're right.
Who mentions him,
You're right.
but that isn't till another 125 years minimum after Apollonius has died.
Yes.
So that's long. I mean, we're talking now 125 years after the Gospels were written.
Yes.
So if we apply this, we'd have to say, number one, is this credible testimony? Well, it's very long after the event. It might be credible, it may not. We look at other things. It's not multiply attested. It's not enemy attested like we have with the resurrection of Jesus. We can't trace it back to an eyewitness. When you read Philostratus' biography, he appeals to a source named Damas of Nineveh. Well, he couldn't have had a Damas of Nineveh because Nineveh had actually been destroyed several hundred years before Christ. He's not going to be living still in Philostratus' day. And there's not a resurrection. In fact, in that biography, Philostratus has Apollonius say there's no such thing. You're not raised in a body. And the only appearance we have is one to an unnamed disciple of Apollonius who appeared to him in a dream, and that was it. And it's at an unnamed time after the event allegedly occurred. So, I mean, there's nothing like we have with the resurrection of Jesus. Multiple independent accounts, traceable to the eyewitnesses within just a few years afterward, and the inability of naturalistic explanations. I mean, there's a really good naturalistic explanation that can explain the Apollonius, and that would be that Philostratus was writing this for someone, to the emperor's wife, to be a competitive account against Christianity. So there's really good, when you subject it to historical methodology, it really fails in this sense.
Yeah, most historical methodology. But what I'm saying is, and I don't think that Apollonius is Christ. I don't believe that Apollonius is God. Or in my speech, I would have told you, I'm an Apollonius. Well, the problem is, the methodology that you use, which applied to Jesus, if you apply it to Apollonius, because he was seen by a disciple after his death, then your methodology proves Apollonius
Not
true.
at all. I just explained a number of reasons why the account of
It
Apollonius
makes it harder, but your
fails.
methodology would still satisfy.
Well, it isn't, because there's only one source, and that's Philostratus' biography. It's written quite a long time after the event. It contains details like Damas that we know is false. He didn't exist. It talks not about resurrection either, so it's not even a really good parallel there. And a naturalistic explanation presents itself. So in terms of plausibility, in terms of scope, power, it fails these criterion. You mentioned Krishna. Well, I spoke a while back with Edwin Bryant, who teaches at Rutgers. He's one of the leading experts on Hinduism. He says the earliest account we have of Krishna doesn't really say anything except he's worshipped. There's no accounts whatsoever that talks about Krishna being crucified or resurrected. So I don't know where you got that from.
Okay, I'm happy to share my sources.
All right, one last thing here then. The oral tradition. You know, what's really nice is when we're looking at it in the New Testament, even the Gospels, there are ways for us to check it. And when we do this, we can see that these guys like Matthew and Luke, they stick to their source mark very carefully.
Time.
Okay. You say that historically, the whole theme of this talk tonight is that you say historically we can prove the resurrection of Jesus. We can prove a miracle. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a mathematical equation that can prove the existence of God? And I know what you're about to say, this is a red herring, but I'll get there. I promise you. I'll show you where I have connection. Is there a mathematical equation that can prove that there is a God? Or that miracles happen?
No, that's using the wrong tool. It's like trying to find cancer with a telescope.
Right. So here's the problem with using. Here's the problem with using history to look at theology. History, math, and science deal with our physical world. As soon as we step into the realm of supernatural, then we deal in a realm of theology. The problem here is if you start using your methods to be applied to theology as history, aren't you using a telescope in order to do surgery?
Actually, I'd say no. I'm not doing anything different than, say, what an astrophysicist does when he or she posits a black hole, quarks, strings, gluons. These are theoretical entities posited in order to explain observable phenomena. Physicists have never seen a black hole, probably never will,
Right.
but it does a good job of explaining the observable phenomena, but it's a theoretical entity. All I'm saying is, hey, look, the historical evidence, when you look at it about the resurrection of Jesus, it points to the fact that it strongly suggests that Jesus rose from the dead. Well, we know from science that this isn't going to happen by natural causes, so it must have been a supernatural one. So I'm going to posit a supernatural entity, God, and it does a pretty good job of explaining what could have happened. For all I know, it could have been an alien in a parallel universe doing his PhD experiment that has to deceive humans by coming to Earth and rising from the dead and claiming he's God. I can't prove that that's not the case, but I do think it was a supernatural event as a historian.
Okay. How do we deal with these? And let me shift focus back to the Gospels real quickly, and because we talked about Paul. How do we deal with these contradictions in these stories?
I'd be delighted to deal with that, but really, since I never even appealed to the Gospels tonight, but only
I
Paul's
understand.
literature before, that would be the red herring. And again, I'd be happy to talk about that afterward. I'll stay afterward and talk to anybody about that because, as I mentioned to you at dinner, last 3.5 years, I've been doing studies on the differences in the Gospels. I think they're just very, very reasonable explanations for all of those that you cited.
Okay, so what you're saying is, let's not look at the primary core or the source of where these stories stem. I still don't understand. You're saying let's just not look at them?
Well, I could say, I could grant you for the sake of argument, I don't believe this, what I'm about to say, but I could grant for the sake of our debate and say, the Gospels are historically unreliable documents, and it wouldn't matter what one difference, because that's not the case I was presenting. The case
Okay.
I presented was based on Paul's letters.
So Paul's oral tradition, that's gospel.
the
But
stuff
the
that he,
Gospels aren't.
the stuff that he got, the message that he got and preached, which was corroborated, endorsed by the apostles, and we have corroborative data that shows that Paul was preaching what they were preaching, and they were the alleged eyewitnesses. So it's not this oral tradition that gets corrupted over time. There are controls on it, as there was in oral tradition within Second Temple Judaism. And, people memorize volumes of content unthinkable in our culture.
Any communication scholar, any communication theorist, any rhetorician would tell you that information being passed from one source to the other, that doesn't happen with 100% accuracy. It never has. If you've ever played the game, Gossip Game, or some people call it something
Telephone.
different. Telephone, absolutely. Sorry,
But you have to admit, Shane, that with telephone, come on.
It doesn't happen over.
It's a quick message.
years.
It happens with these children playing this
quick.
thing.
It's not
There's
a-
no controls on it. It's a game, right?
You're
It's
right.
different than-
It's not a gospel. It's not a story that if I were to read to you any one of the gospels and I read that to you over a passage of time, multiple times, whenever you go to retell that story without any kind of written document, to retell that story, something will change.
Time.
Oh,
All
is
right.
it?
Thank you, Mike and Shane. It's time for audience questions. The one aspect of this debate that has kept me up at night. Are there any questions from our audience? We've got two big 6'6" ministers to monitor our microphones. Just line up at either mic. Who has the first question? And if we don't have one, I'm going to ask one. All right. While we're waiting for somebody to come to the microphone, I'm going to ask a question to Shane and Mike. I feel like you've been going around and around on the oral tradition question. How much oral tradition is it when Paul gets his information directly from the eyewitnesses? Is that even part of this argument? And I'm going to let Shane answer first, and then Mike, I'm going to let you answer.
Okay. Right. Anytime that there's any kind of passing of a story, any kind of storytelling involved, whether it goes from eyewitness to another person, that's what I was talking about earlier with hearsay information. So that's still storytelling. However, any eyewitnesses that were there never wrote anything, or at least we never discovered anything. So I don't know if that's answering your question. That's what we would consider an oral tradition.
Well, Paul, as a rabbi, was a scribe. I think what Mike's saying is he got it from the gospel writers, then he wrote it down. I'll let you both weigh in on that.
Well, there's a lot of work that's been done over the last several decades on oral tradition in antiquity. Perhaps the first prominent name is Birger Gerhardsen, who wrote extensively on it, and then his student Samuel Bierskog. And his was more the rabbinic Pharisaic method that said, as the Pharisees, the rabbis, they memorized volumes of content that we wouldn't even conceive of doing in today's culture. There was no printing press and 90% illiteracy rate, so oral tradition was taken very seriously. The competing view to that within today's academic debate would be put forth by Kenneth Bailey, who for decades has studied oral tradition in the Middle East, and has found, and his is a little more flexible, but the core is always unalterable, but there are certain details in the periphery that can be altered according to the audience. And Jesus probably did this, and that's why he taught in parables, because as any itinerant preacher or teacher does, we can change like jokes or illustrations and things to alter the story to make it more applicable to the audience. So it's not this just free-for-all out there, like the game of telephone or I forgot what it was that Shane called it. This was a very, very controlled type of exercise that people did with oral tradition in
There is
Second
an
Temple
account,
Judaism.
however, I remember reading, so maybe I shouldn't say this because I can't remember exactly where I read it, but I know I've read in passing you say that these storytellers in oral traditions were given certain liberties. Mm-hmm. So is it that controlled at the point that these storytellers have liberties to change the story?
They do, and we can see some of that happening in the Gospels. Boy, I wish I had more time. I could give some of the examples. But the thing is, most scholars today agree that Matthew and Luke used Mark as one of their sources.
Yes.
So, and possibly a hypothetical source called Q.
Yeah.
So what makes it nice is we can actually test how much liberties Matthew and Luke took by their use of Mark and to a lesser extent Q. And when we do this, we see that they never alter the core. They may change at times some peripheral details, but it never changes the story.
Okay, Mike.
They're not major in any sense.
I'm going to stop at this point. My point was that if Paul, a rabbi, got it from the gospel witnesses and wrote it down, that oral tradition isn't even as much of a part of the debate as you both are making it out to be. Is this our first question? All right.
Hello, my name is Joseph Roberts. Thank you both for coming in and doing this for us tonight. I have a quick question for Mike, but it's open to both of you if you'd like to respond. Isn't it possible that Paul, one man, hallucinated on the road to Damascus when he says that he saw the Spirit of Jesus? That's my question. Thank you.
Would you repeat that again? I missed it.
Isn't it possible that Paul, who's one man, could have hallucinated? Because you said that hallucinations don't happen in groups.
Yeah.
Paul is one man.
Yeah, great question. First of all, when we talk the road to Damascus, his experience, that is in Luke, or that's in Acts, which I didn't use. And so if we do grant Acts, then we get a whole lot more, because Paul does in Acts preach bodily resurrection of Jesus and so forth. And if we take Acts, there were traveling companions with Paul. Hallucinations aren't group experiences, and it said that they heard the voice and they saw the light. They just didn't understand what the voice was saying. So it wouldn't have been a group hallucination. It wouldn't have been a hallucination because it was a group experience if we take Acts, which I do, but I didn't present it in the argument. Another thing we could say is, you could say, like with the appearance to Peter, on the surface, you could say perhaps that Peter experienced a hallucination. But then when you look and you say, well, it would have had to been Peter, it had to been James, he would have had to experience hallucination, the group hallucination to the 12, to all the apostles, to more than 500. Remember, you got to account for all those things. And you look at all of that put together and you say, gosh, no, it's probably not a hallucination even on Peter's part. It makes much more sense to think that this was an actual appearance of the risen Jesus to them.
Thank you, Mike. Does anybody have a question for Shane now? Yes.
My question is, I hope this isn't a red herring. Since we know we hear Jesus Christ's name still today, and he's been persecuted for many, many years, why do we still hear his name today, but I've never heard of any of these other Christ figures?
You could either account for it by culture, by empirical powers that have pushed the story, that this story is a story that those powers throughout history that has created our culture have wanted to say is true. There's a lot of reasons why this name may have lasted for a certain length of time. I told you about Horus. Have you ever heard of the name Ra as a god of Egypt? Okay. Well, whenever I say Horus, most Western cultures refer to that being Ra. They're the same people. So at the point that you've heard of Ra, now you've heard of a name as a god for 5,000, 6,000 years. It's had staying power as well.
Okay, Mike, what do you have on that? Anything? Are we ready?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a red herring, but I wouldn't use that as an argument just for Christianity or others. I mean, you could say, well, Muhammad, that name and the religion of Islam has stayed. Hinduism, which is older than, it was before Christ, that stayed around with Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita, etc. So just because it's ancient, I wouldn't say that means it's authentic.
Right.
All right, who's next? And do we have a question from Mike? Okay. All right, let's go with Shane again.
All right, first of all, I'm a believer in Christ. Second, you talked about the other cultures that has developed stories of Jesus Christ, similarities. So what's the possibility that this story is actually true and just everybody made it to fit their culture?
Early Christian historians, and we'll take the count of Justin Martyr, okay? Justin Martyr was an early 2nd century Christian historian, and he noticed that there were similarities between other God stories and Jesus' story. And he writes on those to try to explain that there's nothing different in this story in these regards, so don't think that this is any kind of extra leap of faith that I'm taking. Ask your question one more time to make sure that I'm answering it right.
As of the cultures, to fit their culture, the story of Jesus Christ.
Right.
They made it fit their culture in their stories so that their people would accept it.
Right, okay. And where does these characteristics maybe stem from? Is that where you're asking?
Correct.
I don't know. You have writers like L.D. Murder and S. Sire that would explain that the oral tradition stems from early man's accounts for what went on in the sky. If you want, I would love to spend some time talking to you about that, about why there was a 3-day waiting period in these stories. Early man, while they didn't have as much understanding of science, we shouldn't just say they were stupid. They were pretty smart. And oral traditions kind of play into account there, that the way that they told these stories of what was happening in the sky, which would tell them what to do, the rains are coming, or it's time to plow up the fields. They told these stories in an oral tradition to help them remember it. And as these stories may have permeated throughout cultures, maybe they saw these stories as gods in the sky. We know in the broad. Oh, sorry.
We have 5 seconds left. I'm going to say that we're going to have one more question because our period's over, to Mike. Anybody got a question for Mike? Yes.
My name's Maria. How do you explain,
Give us 3
like,
more
our
minutes.
religion where we believe Jesus has risen, but like the Jehovah Witness believe he is yet to rise?
Well, Jehovah's Witnesses do believe that Jesus was raised from the dead. They just deny the bodily resurrection, and that's based on a misinterpretation of Paul's writings.
All right. All right, John, we are going to have a 5-minute break where our debaters plan their closing statements. John, our pastor, has some announcements. We are also going to take up a love offering for our Truth series tonight and the next 3 Wednesday nights. I hope you can attend. John?
All right, I'm going to ask you guys, don't get up and leave. This is not a break unless you have to go to the bathroom or something. Okay? 'Cause we're going to try to finish this up pretty quickly here. I know one of the things you're feeling is frustrated because we want to ask about 100 more questions. Wouldn't you like to have this for about a week, not just a short time? But we're glad for the time we have here tonight. Okay, I'm going to ask our ushers to go ahead and come forward. Now, this is simply an offering to help us with the expenses of the Truth series in general. So if you're our guest, we don't expect you to give anything unless you'd like to. This is not an offering for our church budget, so if you're not a Christian, you're not interested in that, but you like us doing the series, we'd love you to help it. But you just give whatever you would see fit. You can make a check out to First Baptist Church if you'd like to. All right, guys, go ahead and start doing that. While they're doing that, if you can give to the offering and listen at the same time, let me tell you what's coming up in the Truth series. All right, these 4 weeks are like nothing we've ever done before. All right, we want to equip you to understand your faith and to defend your faith. All right, so next Wednesday we're going to have Josh McDowell here. And if you know anything about Josh McDowell, this is one of the greatest communicators on culture, on family, on technology in our day. And y'all, this is going to be an amazing, amazing day next Wednesday. So do not miss it next Wednesday night, same time. Now on the 25th, I'm blown away that we're going to, looks like, pull this off. My friend Samir Muhammad, that I've told you about for many, many years, a Salafi Muslim. Bin Laden was a Salafi Muslim who was raised and preparing to be someone who would have wanted to kill us all. In fact, that was what he wanted to do. Memorized half the Quran and did the prayer call at a very radical mosque, all these things. You've seen his picture. We'll show you again when he's here, his before and after picture. And radically changed by an encounter with Jesus Christ, and now full-time serving the Lord as an evangelist and also helping shelter and help Muslim background believers. Samir's been in prison 4 times or jail 4 times himself, so he's now helping others who are following Jesus as he has. He's gotten a visa, and this is something I never thought would happen. He's going to be here with us, and that's on the 25th of this month. Now, on February 1st, we have Sandra Tanner, a former Mormon. All right, we're going to talk about Mormonism. Now, I want to tell you, we're not attacking any particular political candidate. We won't name names, all right? That's not the purpose of this, but it's related. All right, this is a critical time, and we all ought to understand these kind of things. So everybody's talking about Mormonism. What does it mean? You know, what does it mean? Is it something that we need to accept as Christian or not? All right, and so we're going to help you with that and help you understand. Okay, we had somebody fall down. We're going to get help over there. Okay, we got our medical team over there, and looks like we're okay. All right, okay. So that's going to be on February 1st, Sandra Tanner. All right, so be here for that. Now, listen to me carefully. Yeah, we look like we're okay over here. Had a trip and fall. Okay, thank God. We're okay. All right. Now, you've got a card that was given you when you came in. Let me refer you to this just a moment. This is for everybody. Okay, so if you take this out and look at it, give us as much or as little information as you want to, but we want you all to fill this out if you would. Because at the end, we're going to ask you to do something that will help us know how this whole debate impacted you. All right, so there's a lot of information here, and if you're not comfortable with any of it, just don't give it to us. But particularly this side with information about who you are, and then when you turn to the back, a little information about your family. We use some of this on Sunday morning, so it says, I attended at what time. That doesn't apply, but it would really help us if you would check, I'm a member or I'm a guest or any of these kind of things. Now, the My Response section, we're not through yet, so just hang on to that, all right? And the little thumbs up or thumbs down you see, don't bother that yet. We'll tell you what to do with that in just a few moments, all right? I think we're about finished with the offering. We're going to move forward so we finish on time. And we're going to move now to the closing statements, 5-minute closing statements from both these guys. And then since I'm pastor, I get the last word, and I'll finish this up in a moment.
All right, we're going to begin with a final statement from Mike Lacona.
Well, thank you. This has been wonderful being here this evening, and I want to thank Shane for just an enjoyable, delightful exchange. In my opening statement, I said I was going to construct a positive historical case for Jesus' resurrection using 2 major building blocks, facts and method. I first presented 5 facts. These were largely undisputed by Shane. He didn't really dispute any of those. In terms of, and then I said method. I gave 4 criteria that historians used for the best explanation. Let's go ahead and say and look at some of the things he did say. He did say in terms of the method, it was flawed. He gave the listening test, and he said he just read the story once about the crime that took place in Norfolk, and but just read it once. But this really doesn't at all resemble what oral tradition was like in Second Temple Judaism. Oral tradition in antiquity was very controlled. They even had methods of doing this. There's ancient books written on how people memorize things and specific methods for doing this. There was what was called craei, that they would put things in easily remembered forms, things that would help them along. He said, well, the Gospels were unreliable. I said, well, this is a red herring because I never mentioned the Gospels. I appealed to literature before that. He said, well, yeah, but the principles involved in the corruption of the Gospels would be available with Paul. And I said, well, not at all. The oral tradition, he got directly from the Jerusalem apostles, so it didn't go through hundreds or thousands of mouths before it got to Paul. He got it straight from the Jerusalem apostles, and he claimed to be an eyewitness himself. He presented this resurrection, some of the resurrection and Jesus tradition in the form of a creed in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 8, which I showed and put up on a slide on there. I delivered to you what I also received. And most scholars who study the subject, virtually all who specialize in this area, agree that this is pre-Pauline tradition that's embedded in Paul's letters. We can also test how this oral tradition changed over time. For example, the words of Jesus in the Last Supper, as Luke has preserved in his gospel. Luke is writing anywhere between 5 and 30 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. And if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he's got the words of Jesus at the Last Supper, and it's virtually word for word. It's just remarkable at how the oral tradition had been preserved in its integrity over all those years. We can also test, as I mentioned, Matthew and Luke by how well they use Mark, and we find that they stick to their sources and take fewer liberties than just about anyone that we can see in antiquity. With the method, I also presented the 4 standard criteria for the best explanation that's standard in historical investigation by professional historians. All Shane could say to this, he didn't call into question any of the criteria. He just said, well, you got all these parallels of dying and rising gods in other religions. I showed that these are, not only a lot of these are inaccurate details, you have to combine several of these figures together in order just to get one Jesus, because none of them contain all of these kinds of details that he mentioned. Many of the details we know about Jesus are true. So even agnostic, atheist, Jewish historians of Jesus will acknowledge that Jesus performed deeds that both he and his followers sincerely believed were divine miracles and exorcisms. So, and Jesus was actually crucified. I doubt that Shane would doubt that. So if these are legitimate details that we can prove historically with reasonable and adequate certainty, well, what difference does it make if you have someone later on, hundreds of years after Jesus, that they tell the same kind of story? If anybody's copying who is it? And they do post-date Jesus. So I think at the end of the day, what we're looking at here is, again, I built this positive historical case using facts and method. At the end of the day, we see that my case for the resurrection still stands. And one by one, all these different naturalistic explanations have bit the dust over time. There just is nothing that can even come close to the strength of the resurrection hypothesis when you submit it to strictly controlled historical method. And that, again, that just makes me excited to be a Christian today. we have nothing to be ashamed of. We don't have to leave our minds at the doorstep. The Christian view is an intellectually viable view. In fact, I think it's the most plausible and unified theory of reality. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go really quick, and I'm sorry for this one. I'm trying to stick as much information in direct refutation as I possibly can. Now, let's look specifically at his method. His method is more explanatory scope, more explanatory power, plausibility, ad hocs. Okay, well, let me give you an alternative scenario. I'm not saying that this scenario happened, and I'm not saying that I subscribe to this scenario, but this is a scenario that probably meets more of his methodology of what could have happened in this alternative scenario of Jesus' death. Jesus gets buried by Joseph of Arimathea, okay? Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Sanhedrin. Jesus' relatives get upset that a member of the Sanhedrin takes this body and puts it into their tomb. This is the equivalent of taking someone and putting them in your family. They then, Jesus' family, then in the dead of night, these family members raid the tomb, take the body, and to bury for themselves. On the way, Roman soldiers kill them, throw them in a common burial spot. In 3 days, women go to prepare the body, and it's empty. Now, let's look at those facts. People did raid tombs. Roman soldiers did kill civilians while on lookout. And people were buried in common burial plots or common graves. This is a historical, not theological account of explanation of what may have happened. There's nothing supernatural here. All of these could have happened. It has more explanatory scope, explanatory power, less ad hocs, because ad hocs actually need to be plausible or possible, and it's absolutely plausible. No miracle can be plausible. If you'll show the first slide, please. He's talking about external sources from the gospel. I want to go ahead and show you real quickly. These are the names of accredited first century historians. If you'll go to the second slide, please. These are the name of the 4 historians that most apologists will use. Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Josephus. If you'll go to the third slide, please. I want you to notice what's highlighted there, the word Christ for Pliny the Younger. If you'll go to the next slide, slide 4, Tacitus, Christus, and the next one, Suetonius, Chrestus. All these words are the same, Christ. And I told you before that Christ is a term that's used for the anointed one. So those 3 historians that most apologists accredit for mentioning Jesus didn't actually mention Jesus. They mentioned Christ. If you'll remember the opening statement that I made, I explained that there are multiple people claiming to be Christ at this time. A lot of people, or a lot of apologists, will then look to Josephus. Josephus, not only has his work been under scrutiny as being a forgery since early on, and still is considered a forgery today by most historians. Even Christian church historians would claim that a lot of his stuff is forgery. Actually, if you'll go to slide 8, please. You'll read here where Dr. Nathaniel Laudner, who is a very well-respected, accredited Christian historian, which will explain to you that it was never quoted by any of our Christian ancestors before Eusebius. Eusebius, sorry. It's disturbing narrative. The language is quite Christian. The passage is a false fabrication. And this is admitted with other church leaders along with the Bishop of Warburton. We'll also look how Josephus is discredited with the ideas of Masada. A lot of the things that he said happened didn't actually happen, and our archaeological evidence proves that it didn't happen. But Josephus contradicts himself in almost every work, through Antiquities to the War of the Jews to against Apon. If you'll go to the 14th slide. What do we know that Jesus saw? I mean, not Jesus, sorry. What do we know that Paul saw? Nothing. We don't know that he saw anything because Paul didn't see Jesus when Jesus was alive, and he didn't see Jesus before the ascension. So Paul saw a vision.
Time.
Okay, and you can just kind of read the slide.
All right, if you give me just 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to finish up. First of all, I want to say that what we're doing here models an awful lot about who we are as a church. And if you're here and you're a guest and maybe you've heard this or that about who we are, I hope you've learned a couple of things tonight about who we are as a church. Number one, we are utterly unafraid of examining facts. We're utterly unafraid of that. Our faith, we believe, is grounded upon intellectual truth, not some blind leap of faith. And so we hope maybe that's been an eye-opener for a few of you that are our guests. Secondly, we believe that Christianity has messed a lot of things up. We believe Christianity is an institution. I've written a book about this called If God Were Real. And we believe the word Christian is a good word. The word Christianity turns a movement into an institution, and it's messed a lot of things up. One of the things that messed up is that Christians in churches began to treat people like Shane as an enemy. But Jesus treated people like Shane as his friend. And he would do things like go out and eat with them, which we just did, right? And he hung out with them, and he enjoyed being with them because Jesus was confident that what he said when he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, was true. And he was not intimidated by spending time with people who didn't believe him or at that time didn't live the way they should be living. And we want you to know that's who we are. That is our heart. So if you're here tonight as a seeker, an agnostic, an atheist, whoever you are, we are glad you are here. We apologize for any time you've ever felt that Christians treat you like enemies. That's not the Jesus we follow. The Jesus we follow treats you as friend. And, you know, Shane and I really have just begun a relationship, but I really feel like I have a new friend. In fact, Shane is getting married. He's here with his fiancée, Courtney. Courtney, wave at us right here. There she is. Grew up right here in West Monroe. And you may wonder, how did we find Shane? How did we find him? Mike, you know, has been a friend for a long time. Shane is one of the most courageous men around because we couldn't get anybody to do this. If you go online and listen to Mike Lacona's debates, he pretty well wipes out a lot of brilliant people. And believe me, we tried. We asked at 2 different universities. We were seeking for somebody that would come and debate this subject. We did not want to bring in a ringer, someone who Mike would make a fool of, frankly. That's not what we're about. We wanted the very, very best of skeptical thought, of agnostic thought, about the resurrection. So that when you leave here tonight, you know you have heard from the best arguing against what we believe. And so I want to say I admire Shane, a man who would have the courage to do this. And there's something else you ought to know about him. The way we found him initially is that he is my son Trey's debate coach. And so he's not teaching my son theology, or I'd have a little bit of a problem with that. But he's teaching my son how to be a good attorney one day, and who knows, maybe to be a national champion debater, and he's already doing very well. But now I'm bragging on my son, all right? But so I want to say, first of all, Shane, thank you. I have a new friend, and we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, sir.
You bet. And having heard a lot of people debate against the resurrection, I would say Shane could be the best I've heard. So when you leave here, I think you have heard the best you're going to hear of objections against the resurrection of Christ. And that leads me to 2 things I want to say that I don't think are disputable. Now, I'm maybe involving myself a little bit in the debate here, but I'm pastor, so I can. All right? There's 2 things that I don't think really are disputable. And number one is that these same objections, many of them have been raised for generations. There have been those who have raised these objections since the very
beginning. And in fact, I would say that there have been 30 or 40 chances for these objections to take the day, because every generation has had its agnostic heroes who would say, we're going to gain all this knowledge, and one day people are going to say how silly it is to believe these silly Christian myths. But in every single generation, when Voltaire says, 100 years there won't even be a Bible, or Ingersoll says the same thing 100 years later. And now a new generation of agnostics and atheists are saying the same thing. And by the way, I'm glad you're an agnostic, because that means we can actually talk about this, It's a lot easier for us to pray for Shane when he says, it's also a lot less arrogant to say, I don't know if there's a God, but I'm not ruling it out, right? He's not ruling it out, all right? So we're going to pray, Shane, that will be something that one day you'll believe as we do. But over all these generations, these objections have never been able to take the day. In every generation, there have been those who have risen up and said, but wait a minute. Just as Mike has said, it looks to us like there is reasonable evidence for the resurrection of Christ. And so you have some of the greatest minds of history, such as C.S. Lewis, or right now in our day, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, who says, we believe the resurrection of Christ is founded on evidence in such a way that it's not a giant blind leap of faith, but it's a small step of faith to trust. So I think it's indisputable that for every generation has had its shot at the resurrection, but in the minds of millions, the hearts of millions, it still stands. Second thing I would say is indisputable is that for 2,000 years of history, Christ's followers have said this. From the very beginning, when, as Mike showed, 500 people that were many still alive, when Paul wrote it, they could have contradicted it because they were still alive, but since the very beginning of history, of Christian history, 2,000 years of Christ's followers have said this: I've had a personal encounter with the risen Christ. A personal encounter with the risen Christ, and it's changed me forever. And I will live for him, and I will die for him. And they have died and are dying for the gospel right now. And that's not disputable. And many of you are among them, of those who say, we believe. We believe because of history, but also by faith, that Jesus rose, and he has transformed our life. And if you're one of those who is thinking about this, we'd love you to walk with us a little bit. We'd love you to walk with us a little bit. Again, we really love atheists and agnostics and skeptics and seekers around here. We're not a club for Christians, all right? We welcome you here. A couple of things we'd encourage you to do. Number one, talk to us. Myself, our staff, we're very accessible. We'd love to take you to lunch, take you to dinner, sit down with you, talk, share, throw out ideas. Number two, pray. You say, I don't believe in God. Try this as a prayer. God, if you're real, show me. Show me. I mean, if he's a big boy, right? If he's real, he might be able to show you. We challenge you to pray it. To say, Jesus, if you rose, show me. Bring about some way that I will be able to believe in the evidence and by faith. Show me. We challenge you to do that. And it might be that there's somebody here tonight, in listening to this, you've been seeking and you're already at that point. You're saying, okay, I needed to know that there was some clear evidence, and I want to take a step of faith. Close your eyes for just a moment. And if that's you, if you're thinking, I'm ready to take a step of faith, just simply ask him. Just say, Jesus, I believe you rose. Say it in your heart. And I want you in my life, and I want to follow you in life or in death. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, if you did that, we'd love to know it. And on the card, there's a place for you to check under my response to today's services that during the service I prayed and received Christ. We'd love to know that. It would make our day to know that, because obviously that's what we believe. Now, here's what I'd like all of you to do. You see on your card where there's a thumbs up, thumbs down? We're not asking you who won the debate. You know, my son is learning how to debate things that he does not believe. That's what you teach him to do that, right? Yeah. So I kind of wonder if you're telling us the truth. You sure you're an agnostic? Come on now, you're not sneaking around on us, are you? All right, okay, I believe him. Because my son's told me about debates. He's debated points he doesn't believe at all, but they assign them plus, or, the for or against. We're not asking you who you think won the debate, because somebody can win or lose the debate, and you still may not know what's the actual truth. What we're asking you is, has this experience tonight increased your confidence in the resurrection or harmed your confidence in the resurrection? If it's increased your confidence in the resurrection, circle thumbs up. If it's harmed your confidence in the resurrection or made you less confident in it, then circle thumbs down. And
then, whatever information you feel like you'd share with us, do that, and then put it, there's boxes on the way out. They're at every door, aren't they, Toby? Every door, brown boxes. Just put the card in there, and we promise not to send a SWAT team to your door or anything like that. We don't do that. If you want us to contact you, if you want to talk to us, make a note of it, tell us, and we will. But this will just help us for our future planning. Now, one last thing. Please get Mike's books on the way out. And here's why. Shane brought up some new stuff. Can you bring up new stuff in the closing argument? Is that legal? Oh, I've caught the debate coach here. All right, he brought up some new stuff in the closing argument that Mike didn't get to refute. I've read Mike's works, and some of the things I was going, I wish Mike had one more chance. I want you to get his books because they are masterful. And so if any of these things, if you thought, well, that does sound a little unusual, I promise you, if you get Mike's books, you're going to see them dealt with in detail. All right, and so I hope you'll get them on the way out. Mike didn't ask me a single word about promoting his books. I'm asking you to do it because they're worth getting. It supports Mike, and it'll help you because a lot of you are going, I need more. You'll get more when you read Mike's books, all right? Now, this Sunday, last thing I'll tell you, and we'll go, this Sunday, I'm going to do something very unusual. I am not a cult leader. I am a kind of a normal guy. I don't believe the Mayan calendar. The title of my message this Sunday is Why the World Will Come to an End in 2012, How It Will Happen and What to Do About It. Let me repeat that. Why the world will come to an end in 2012, how it will happen, and what to do about it. Now, those of you that know me are already suspicious there's something sneaky about this title, and there is. But it's a real title, and you'll know Sunday why it has real meaning. Now, I want you to take that and use it to get somebody here. I'm just unashamedly telling you. Tell somebody your crazy preacher is going to tell you why the world's ending in 2012. And they won't really feel, too shafted by what I'm actually going to say, all right? They'll understand why the title makes sense. But this is going to be a potentially powerful Sunday. We hope that you'll be here. Have you enjoyed being here tonight? All right, great. Thank you, guys. Thank these two. Pray for Mike and everywhere he goes and these debates and all he does. God bless y'all. Have a great week. See many of you Sunday.